read a number of books through the years at the library next to my home, and some I held close to my chest, so dear, but they were always on loan. But if the pages make me smile like a fool, maybe for once I won't follow the rules. I'll keep it until it's long overdue, when I find my favorite book to read. You're my favorite book to read.
So if you want to know who I am, one of the best ways is to just look at this bookshelf, because I essentially designed it with the things that I love, grouped into the sections that I love them by, because I imagine it as this sort of ever-evolving bookshelf of me, of the new things that I'm interested in and the old things that I was interested in. Also, it's organized by the way the authors would hang out with each other if they were all at a party. And it would be a perfect place to just start by going through the bookshelf section by section. So let's do that. Sometimes I want sections to be near each other because they kind of overlap. So somebody, who's a mathematics major might be interested in finance, or they might be interested in business, or somebody who's into genetics might be interested into longevity. Some things like our mathematical universe or user illusion are kind of something that can be closer to imagination. So then you think about the imagination, and then imagination kind of gets you into like magic or things like of that nature. So there is a flow to it. I start with the kids section, I'll go over this way, down this way, and down that way. Okay, so let's start with just the kids section. I am a huge Calvin and Hobbes fan. It's one of my favorite things that I read as a child. And this is just the picture album and adventure book that we've made, which is just a photo album of all the people from Las Vegas area, the podcast, from Zappos, from Jen's Magic Career. A lot of our best friends are just in this, so we decided to print out a bunch of photos and put them in like a real world way. Issue number 1, Zatanna, totally still in mint condition. We have like serious dog fever. Jen and I don't have a dog yet, but she subscribes to like every dog that exists on Instagram, and we've got this book that's just like literally puppies and dogs. Okay, so I call this section just systems thinking, but it can be anything from like a stock and flow model to talking about entropy to understanding exponentials, black swan events, why things might sink, so like emergent properties. And I have the train here. You can see like the back and the front of the train, because a lot of times when I would learn about entropy, it was first really researched in steam engines. So it's really kind of a nod to how entropy and the laws of thermodynamics kind of came into being. So that's why I thought the train made a lot of sense to be the bookends for this section. So I could definitely talk a lot about each of these individual books, but when I think about some things more like statistics or Bayesian statistics, I kind of think about, thinking in bets, or some of the Bayesian kind of different than a frequentist sort of way to think about probability and risk in the world. When I see Sync, this is one of the best books ever for emergent properties. I've got a memory of when they talked about how fireflies will, in some cases, blink all in unison because the males are competing with their neighbors and they end up in this weird equilibrium. So it shows how in chaotic systems you can have these moments of equilibrium. This book Edward Glaser wrote, called Triumph of the City, was a big influence for a rebuilding project I was part of here in downtown Vegas. And Triumph of the City has some interesting scaling law issues, the same way as Geoffrey West's book Scale, but which Geoffrey West has like kind of really pioneered the 3/4 scaling law. So when a mammal or an animal gets like twice as big, because insides are kind of not as dense, you have a 3/4 scaling law for the veins and things like that. But Triumph of the City talks about this because when you have a city double in size, you don't necessarily need twice as many gas stations. There's a scaling law. So this was kind of a big thing that we were thinking about at the downtown project. My last job, I programmed with Neo4j, which is a graph database architecture, and we did really interesting stuff. So graph theory is sort of at the core of that. The Drunkard's Walk is some of the early randomness stuff. And one of the canonical examples for graph theory is the bridges of Königsberg, where there was, a question like, can you cross these bridges only once and end up in each landmass? They proved that it wasn't possible with the invention of graph theories. Just general systems thinking. Of course, anti-fragile, it's about having a word for things that get stronger the more they're perturbed, the more they're pushed, just like the human body. And we just are kind of like missing that from our vocabulary. And the model thinker, origins of wealth is really interesting. They've ran some models in here where you sometimes have these really small, kind of repetitive things that happen and complexity can emerge from it. Or if you've ever heard of like chaotic systems coming from really tiny deviations in initial parameters, then blowing up into these like super chaotic differences in the long run, the butterfly flaps its wings sort of metaphors, or why kind of the rich can get richer, and no matter how many times you restart society, it keeps happening over and over again. Like a lot of that stuff is covered in Origins of Wealth, and I don't know, these are really awesome books. I would love to talk with any of you about any of them, and I'm sure they'll be incorporated into Dylan Curious as we go forward. I'm still into dinosaurs, never outgrew it. T-Rex just likes to jump right out of there. Okay, so this is the makers and material science section. Obviously, it's really thin. This is not something that I know a lot about yet, but I am anticipating we do some videos on 3D printed food, 3D printed houses, 3D printed materials, material science in general. So this will be that section as I learn more. I'm not an expert by any means yet, but it sounds fun to get into like a real world makerspace and do more IRL stuff. And I thought that would be good for this book, How To, because it has these fun questions like, what if the world was made of gummy bears, or you built a lava moat around your house to keep out ants, and then kind of plays with like the realities of what would happen with absurd things, and I sort of like that too. So we'll keep growing this section. Okay, so this section is where I really think about big history or deep history in terms of biological life. So when you think about the blind watchmaker, Richard Dawkins is saying like, how could we have all this complexity if there wasn't like a grand designer? So really kind of digging into what it is that makes your genes pass on, but also creates biological life that's so diverse, and how you have things like peacocks, and understanding what life was like before modern world, so we can get a sense of what kind of things will trigger our hormones, what kind of things will make us happy, what kind of things our brains are designed to do, and what things they're probably weaker at. This is the thought process that I use to figure out why things sometimes feel wrong in a modern society, because we had millions of years to evolve in a world that was very different from like electricity and running water and societies with this many people in them. So when I think about that, I try to think about like the psychology or the hormones, and this section gives me kind of the view of that. Magicians of the Gods is pretty interesting because it's a different history just in the last kind of 10, 20,000 years about kind of why Atlantis might not be such a fake thing, but there could have been big blocks of ice that have melted since then, kind of depending on what the evidence you believe in, but that's a really interesting one. So Sapiens is a real must read because only 100,000 years ago, there were 6 different species of human. So we think, oh, we're so different from the monkeys, but you're like, but were you that much different from like Homo erectus or some of the other human species? Because maybe they felt very much like modern humans if we could have met them, like had fire, probably could have spoken language, even if it was something like sign language or something not as complex as what we have. Or maybe smarter. They might have been smarter than us. We just lost more hair and ran in the desert longer. So those kind of things are what I like this section to be about, like what brought us to here. So we had these wolves, right? And then the ones that were more and more friendly were the ones that humans were more and more aligned with, and we started using them for shared hunting, and we really grew together and domesticated them into dogs of different breeds that have different personalities. And then you have to say, like, wouldn't that probably apply to humans too? And you see interesting patterns between like bonobos and chimps, and how their societies had different access to food, and the way females kind of were kind of more or less powerful at certain times, and it sort of changed the way that the societies run, and the females kept, mating with the guys who were the kindest and the ones that were most willing to work with other people. So we've kind of gone through these human evolutions that you just don't think about too much. And I also really like Jared Diamond's book, The World Until Yesterday, because he captured some of the things I think about a lot. What was it like just not that long ago, but a few hundred years ago, or societies that aren't really touched by Western civilization, and with some of the things about, just the rituals they had. But it's interesting the way that some of the pre-modern societies use gender differently than us, and how they're kids are raised in communities, and not so much in these like nuclear families where there's just like parents and kids, and they're all like stuck together all the time. They're just playing throughout communities, and it's just interesting to think about how that would change the way the brain is. What it was like to give birth, what it was like to be a parent, and the kind of different levels of trust that you had to have in those societies, and the way they would like negotiate with their neighbors about like being able to walk on a path, but don't steal any of my pigs, but if you need water, we can figure that out. This whole sort of tribal thing that, you know, it seems to still be in our head. We just kind of manifest it in different ways throughout the country, like in political parties and things like that. But anyways, yeah, so this is kind of the world up until today, what led us to be where we are. Okay, so this section I consider to be about symbiosis. As humans, we're not alone. We have an open system on Earth where we're interacting with viruses and bacteria and other mammals and other species, and everything is connected in some way, right? So there's no just like isolating us completely. These books I really got first interested in when I was learning about the microbiome. So we have more DNA in our body that's not human than is human, and that's because our guts are just lined with all of these species that, you know, do things that help with digestion. They eat sugar and they output different things, in some cases hormones, and some cases God knows what, but that's why you have to eat fiber, right? So that got me thinking about our microbiome. Then I started thinking about the virome, so all the viruses and how they also kind of live in us and potentially can even get past the blood-brain barrier, and maybe even bacteria does. It's new science, but maybe not. But if you go beyond just gut bacteria, you understand that there's a lot of mental connections too. So the way that we think, the amount of energy we have, the drive to get out of bed in the morning, they could very well be connected to our immune system function. If we feel like we're sick or we're contagious, there's probably an evolutionary reason why you would want to feel alone or feel isolated, which, you know, just isn't good for humans. We were meant to be social creatures. So that mind, gut, brain connection, the virome, the microbiome, and the symbiosis that we have with everything, including like how mitochondria inside of our, you know, the organelle inside of our cells might have been its own bacteria at one point, and in just a weird freak incident, it kind of got consumed, but just started generating power, and then that became, from then on, part of evolution in our branches. So I just like the idea of thinking about us as one and connected with the earth. Okay, so for this section, this is started as just like genetics. Like I was curious about DNA and like what that means for like risk of inheriting diseases and things like that. But then I went down this rabbit hole with epigenetics, and I sort of realized that, wow, just because the book has certain words in it, if you read the book out of order, which are these little things called histones that can wrap around your DNA and sort of turn them on or off, it's a completely different book, right? And we have a lot of control over our epigenetics. That could also be a good avenue for us to investigate in Dylan Curious, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of breakthroughs once the computation is there to really understand what the difference in people's histones are. And then there's CRISPR, right? CRISPR is an actionable investment that you can make today. The story of it being broken down in Walter Isaacson's new book is fantastic. We'll definitely do a Dylan Curious on it. Now, Jennifer Doudna definitely feels like she's the Steve Jobs of the synthetic biology world. I think she's very deserving of a Nobel Prize, and I just learned a ton about where the different companies are and everything from this book, so I know we'll cover that. Bioinformatics in general, just where computation meets epigenetics and genetics, I think is going to be a really interesting field. The synthetic biology field will be huge, so that's what these books are all about. Okay, so the next one is longevity, but let me get the step stool for that, because longevity is really interesting. I do think that we're maybe going to solve dying, you know, like it's possible that we figure out how to make it so that we don't just generally age out of existence, and that would mean that we would have to die from things like car accidents and things like that. But just going through it, so Dave Asprey, if you know him, he's like a biohacker that does crazy stuff. He injects stem cells and plays with all sorts of different chemicals and bacteria and stuff like that. So I thought that book was really interesting. It got me, in fact, it was that book that first got me thinking about the microbiome. But recently, The Oxygen Advantage, thinking about how we breathe, like how we run, how we breathe. There's this book I read on barefoot running, which I should put up here too. But think about how many people get their wisdom teeth removed and how evolutionary that just probably wouldn't have worked. Like, was everybody in pain like that, or were they that useless, or was it about the roughage that they would eat, or Does that have something to do with the oxygen advantage, like the way you would breathe and run out on the savannah? What are shoes doing to our posture? What is the way that we breathe, both pollution or the weird patterns that we pick up because we have bad posture all the time? And how does that affect our, heart rate and things like that? If you know David Sinclair, he's been kind of making the rounds on the podcast, but he's definitely someone who believes that we can potentially live forever, and NAD is kind of a thing that he's really into, which I was learning about. Blue zones, these are areas of the world where people live the longest, and mimicking their diets in terms of like omega-3s and fish and really lots and lots of vegetables seems like a no-brainer to me, so I felt like that was really interesting. I feel like salt has been demonized. I feel like salt's really kind of good for you, or at least according to that book I picked up a lot. Eating dirt is more about the microbiome sort of and how it affects us. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you should subscribe to Dr. Michael Greger. He's got a channel called Nutrition Facts. The science is great, and I feel like his heart is really in the right place. So How Not to Die is a great book about processed food industry, and the meat industry is just kind of screwed up fundamentally, especially here in the United States. So these are kind of books about longevity. Okay, so coming up here, these books are some of the original like business books. So I was originally part of a startup that was kind of trying to take on Ticketmaster before we ran out of runway, but we did good for a while. It was called Ticket Cake. And at that point, we were still working out of a garage, some friends and I from Utah. And these were the books that kind of got me thinking about like, how do you build a business? So Patrick Lencioni, if you know him, he's all about creating the different kind of organizations that can last throughout time. And of course, Great by Choice is, Jim Collins, you'd probably all know him. Or Creativity Inc. was a great book. Ed Catmull was the CEO of Pixar, and just knowing how he put that together, and they, how the company thought about the future and tried to like skate to where the puck was going. So a lot of those are the business books that influenced me. Math is so fun when you're not thinking about like solving some linear equation, but when you're thinking about like the different levels of infinity and how they kind of like fit into each other, or different ways to look at dimensions of math. Like I found it really fascinating just to have a breakthrough in imaginary numbers and understanding that they're really a third dimension on a two-dimensional number line. And when you think about numbers in dimensions, you can, calculate answers using angles and stuff like that. It's like, there's something very explanatory about math, something much more like fun and interesting than just solving some boring equations. So I feel like I tried to capture some of that here. Also, another interesting thing about thinking about mathematics in terms of multidimensional space is it lends itself really well to thinking about algorithms like gradient descent, which are used oftentimes to define neural networks, or to think about backpropagation using just calculus to tune the network backwards. So I also feel like there's like a lot of overlap in like a multi-dimensional thinking, a more visual take on mathematics in terms of where artificial intelligence is, or even understanding consciousness. When people talk about statistics, they're usually referring to like a frequentist model of statistics. Like you measure something over and over again, and you kind of like put together some sort of bell curve, and then you can like measure it, using calculus. But when you think about Bayesian statistics, you can take your priors, and that's really a fascinating thing too, because that means you can just say like, here is my likelihood, just write down what you think of something happening, and then when you get evidence, you update it, and you're kind of in this more evolutionary process where you're getting closer and closer to the truth. So I wanted to make sure that I had some like Bayesian stuff in there. I love Bayesian statistics, like mental math, which is really kind of fun. And also the mathematics of like multiple dimensions or topology, like geometry does so much to explain the world we live in, including the number line, the number system, and then connecting those to different dimensions, which then eventually connects to physics, which we'll talk about down in that section, and then cosmology, and you're like, oh, is math where reality comes from, or is time a mathematical construct, or I don't know, it gets cool, it just gets cool. I don't say that I understand it, but all of a sudden I have had moments where I thought, wow, this is much different than it felt like it was when I was learning math in school. So I kind of have those. My favorite math books are up in that section. So here are some of my favorite financial books. I do think of value much more broadly than I used to, but these were some books that really kind of broke my mind at first. Like The Creature from Jekyll Island has some really interesting stuff about some of the wealthiest people, in the past 100 years, and how they've done things to the government that have kind of constructed the way that we live our lives. And recently I read the deficit myth, which is kind of the opposite of a lot of the arguments that are made in these other books, where creating a deficit is super beneficial. It's kind of like how society works. If you create your own money, you need to create your own demand, and if you use that demand to, improve things like GDP, but even more importantly, happiness and productivity and creation of new things and inventions, then it really doesn't matter. Wealth of the Nations, of course, is a must-read if you ever want to talk with anyone about the invisible hands or why markets work. You need to at least have that as a jumping-off point. Ray Dalio's Principles has been great to understand sort of cyclical patterns that can happen in macro economics. And then of course some of the Bitcoin stuff, or the Battle of Bretton Woods really gave me an understanding of how valuable the gold standard was. I never even knew that it was a standard at one point. And some of the history about coinage and how you can kind of debase things and how that can affect inflation. So yeah, a lot of the financial stuff that has influenced me came from that section right there. So here is like, holy cow, out there stuff. So superintelligence completely scared me. I brought up this concept of a paperclip machine AI that eventually destroys the world because it just keeps using more resources to make paper clips because we didn't program it right. Or the Age of M, about what it would be like to be a synthetic digital life when you're really only limited by computation, and that's still growing at Moore's law even thousands of years from now. And of course, like Jeff Hawkins and On Intelligence, and you probably know Ray Kurzweil from all of his Futurism and his work at Google. So these are really kind of far out there visions. Like, what does humanity look like 1,000 to 3,000 years from now? Okay, so this section is more just about the physics and quantum mechanics of the universe that I don't totally understand, but really fascinates me. So a lot of Einstein and Stephen Hawking stuff is in here. And then of course, Flatland, if you know that story about these like two-dimensional creatures that, can't believe that there's a third dimension out there, which is a metaphor for us and what a four-dimensional creature might be like. And of course, the Elegant Universe, you probably know. But this sort of stuff is just fascinating to me. I really don't grasp it deeply, but just to think about quantum gravity or to hear conversations about what it means for electrons to not have a certain place, it just is really fascinating to me. The double slit experiment does keep me up at night, and this is the kind of stuff that helps me, I don't know, just when I want really abstract thoughts about physics and the universe we live in. And definitely need to learn a lot more. You might be surprised that I devoted 5 books on my bookshelf just to sleeping, but I had so much trouble sleeping for so much of my life. I was that late night guy, but I still had to wake up early. And I know that it's really important just to clear out these glial lymphatic systems in our brain and what it does to our biology. And yeah, I just had to go through a real deep understanding of sleep to appreciate it for what it was. So this represents, a time in my life when I needed these books. So this section, surrounded by the 2 brain bookends, are all about consciousness. It's a very deep question, a very interesting thing to think about. Why, I feel like I'm alive, but could I be a brain in a vat? Am I a user illusion that's just feeling the information processing? Is the universe information? Does it tie into this quantum stuff? So I don't know. So these things, they're just about understanding why I'm alive, what consciousness is, and I just love thinking about that. It's somewhere between science and poetry. Okay, so these books are one of my favorites. They're all about using visual spatial acuity that we have as humans to memorize things. So the first book that kind of cued me off was this book, Moonwalking with Einstein by Joshua Foer, but he just uses this example in a TED Talk where he places objects in a room inside of his brain and then remembers his keynotes on it. And I use it on every one of these videos. I use it ever since I've learned, and I had to read a few more things on this, but Memory Palace, if you want to look it up on Wikipedia, total game changer. Every time I give a speech, I imagine objects and I just walk through those objects as I'm giving my speech. It does fade after time, but it does such a good job of keeping the order of things that I've learned, or if I want something like mathematics that kind of builds on each other to be sort of placed in an order, I sometimes do that with big macro concepts. But definitely look into memory palaces and using our evolutionary ability to understand three-dimensional space. Like, we were chasing, animals out on the savannah, and when they went behind trees, we had to imagine where they were or how tired they were. And those tools are the best to use when you're trying to memorize something. Don't just do rote memory, use a memory palace. So down here is my section that's kind of philosophy, but also kind of about happiness. So the science of happily ever after, like what is it in relationships that make them work? Because, you know, it always feels like the grass is greener on the other side for so many people. And I really was like, I gotta solve this problem. Like, what is it that the body and the brain want? What did we evolve for? Because there's something so magical about love. And when you capture it and you know it's there and you know that there isn't anyone else that you're gonna fall in love with, it's just so relaxing, and it feels that way with Jen. But a lot of it was, I guess, learning about love, the science of love, hormones, and the philosophy of kind of like what it means to be, you know, a human being who is social by nature, by definition, and needs to connect with others in a society. So if there is any section of my bookshelf that is just like straight up miscellaneous, it's this one. The Book of Unusual Knowledge, Weirdopedia. What If is a great book. It's like, what if the world was made of gummy bears? What would happen? Or what if the sun disappeared? So just like these weird thought experiments that are just fun and creative and, you know, just kind of easy to pick up and just kind of jump outside of very creative stuff in this section. Okay, down here is all of the stuff that makes me think about how we tell stories. I gave a talk a few years ago on the hero's journey, and when I was giving it, it was all about understanding that there's this general architecture throughout time. You can plug and play thousands or hundreds of thousands of stories in it, but there's, you know, a status quo like Harry Potter. You get a call to action like come to this magical world. You have to go through these adventures where you grow from the status quo to something bigger, something that can overcome something that you originally couldn't, and then you sort of go back to that status quo with a bigger sense of self, a knowledge that you can pass on, a skill that you didn't have before. And that storytelling is in us because our ancestors went through it constantly, and just trying to understand that. And I want to work that into our future videos on Dylan Curious, because we should be saying like, okay, what's optogenetics? Like, we have no idea. We're just clueless people, right? And then let's learn about the history. Let's put that effort in, and then let's challenge ourselves to do something with it, to meet someone, to answer a question or whatever, and then come back and make an investment and be smarter, and then move on to the next challenge in this sort of cyclical way. I want to make sure that we have that hero's journey, that storytelling ability, and that's what that section is all about. I'm red-green colorblind, so I just have this because I can't see them, and it like always blows my mind that you guys can like see numbers in here. But over here are the books that really were about productivity. So GTD, getting things done, making sure that I have some basic tools to like organize my calendar and organize my life, and you know, just stay focused on projects. So this is just kind of real practical project related books. So now let's talk about the marketing section. So that's up here. You know, so sometimes the best idea doesn't always win. I mean, like the Dvorak keyboard was better for typing than the QWERTY keyboard, but like everyone uses a QWERTY keyboard and we're not going back anytime soon. So I kind of was interested in sort of virality or memes, and that's what led me to read some of these books like Made to Stick, The Purple Cow. If you know peak, like there's a kind of a rule that when somebody's done with a movie, they remember like the peak or the end of an experience for like a magic show or something like that. And then this book, Social Physics, I actually got a chance to meet Alex Pentland when I took a tour of MIT, and Social Physics was some of the first times people were tracking cell phones and realizing that, oh, when people get sick, you can go back in time and predict like where an outbreak came from, or using like the wisdom of the crowds to find, they had this project where, I think it was NASA or DARPA, they dropped these random balloons all over the world, and they had people try to put them together using different methods, and like, you know, crowdsourcing was a super successful one. So Made to Stick was authored by Chip and Dan Heath, who came to Zappos when I was working there for an all hands one. So I really got to hear a long form discussion about what makes things stick, and the idea of something being simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional, and can tell a story can help explain what's going on with like TikTok and viral marketing and this world of like, now we even have like meme stocks like GameStop and AMC and Dogecoin, like, you know, now it's like they're even playing a role in finance that I wouldn't have thought they would. So, and Seth Godin, if you know him, he does some really good stuff. Contagious, it's about, you know, about the virality of some ideas and why, you know, some are made to stick and some aren't. So yeah, that's my marketing section. So this section is people who Jen and I like respect and love, and one of them, of course, is Adelaide, who she talked about being one of the famous female magicians. Of course, Einstein's one of my, biography, celebrities. Praveer I worked with at Zappos to help me do some of the systems dynamics. And we actually have a book here, which we should mention because it was authored by the person right there behind the camera. This is Guillermo's book.
So my main character here finds like a little clue that brings him here to Las Vegas, trying to uncover some corruption. He just unveils a secret mafia conspiracy, and then all hell breaks loose.
You're quite the accomplished author, but it's an honor to have your book up here on the shelf. So this section is all about magic. Probably better if I just let her explain this part of the bookshelf.
These are some of my all-time favorite magic books. We have the Royal Road to Card Magic, which my Uncle Steve gave me as a 10th birthday present, and this is the very book that first piqued my interest in magic. In fact, there is an inscription from my Uncle Steve in this book. And so this book is very special to me. The artist badges from filming the Penn and Teller Fool Us show. This was from our 100th show. Maximum Entertainment, both the classic and the 2.0 by Ken Weber. Amazing book on performance. We have Scripting Magic, volumes 1 and 2 by Pete McCabe, which are about writing specifically for magic shows. And of course, The Magic of Johnny Thompson, also a 2-volume set, which contains some of Johnny's signature magic from throughout his career. And Johnny Thompson in magic was incredible. He was so kind and so generous and so knowledgeable, just an absolutely amazing mentor to me and to so many others.
So I can't say that they've influenced me a ton, but I love them because I love her. Okay, so going back up to the top shelf here. So in contrast to the business books that we read over there, these are the ones that are all about startups. So these books were books that, as people who were trying to raise money and work out of a garage and build our first business, that I felt like I needed to understand and read to think differently. The long tail is all about kind of the Amazon model where you just get a little bit of money from all these crazy items because the internet can hold much bigger databases than a real world can, like a real world store. Lean Startup and 0 to 1 are just basic stories of how people in Silicon Valley went from not much to the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Googles, and how The Third Door is a book about how you always think there's a front door and a back door, but there's always a third door. There's always another way to come at something from a completely different angle. And yeah, so I just think that when you're building something from scratch, you've never done it before, you should think, is it a platform? You should think about what kind of protocols it kind of services. You have to think about your industry, especially something we kind of messed up is I thought I knew what the customer wanted, but what I thought they wanted was different enough and expensive enough that it made a difference in our startup. So I wish I would have been more in tune with feedback that people were giving me, just servicing their needs. But I don't know, over time you learn about this kind of stuff. And yeah, so this is really startup culture, because like they say, what gets you here doesn't get you there. So people who can build great startups sometimes can't build great mega corporations. So the kind of CEOs that run big companies versus the kind of people who can create something from scratch. And this is the people who can make something from scratch. Okay, so these books are all about community and culture. Now, when I started working at Zappos, Tony Hsieh, who's famous for this book, Delivering Happiness, and his ability to create a culture where people cared about each other, where we had core values that directed the company much more than other companies, and he's really a thought leader in that space. Originally, I didn't think that much about culture, but I did know that I loved Silicon Valley and I wanted to be part of a startup. So back in Utah, a few friends and I created a company that was a competitor with Ticketmaster called Ticket Cake. And when we came to Las Vegas, priorities of the startups was to do something that was community focused, something that gave back to the other people in the community, to build some kind of a culture, some kind of a bond that would be stronger than sort of the sum of its parts when everybody was participating in it. So we created a podcast, just a sort of fun side project to feature all of the startups and cool things that were happening downtown. I still look back at that as one of the most fun, interesting times of my life. It's where I met Jen and some of my best friends. Welcome to the Downtown Podcast. My name is Dylan, and every Thursday night we fill my living room full of friends, community members, and visitors to share the stories, ideas, and people that make downtown Las Vegas so special. We live in the middle of an experiment that prioritizes people above money, and one day may become the blueprint for anyone interested in the benefits of a community at the scale of a city. And of course, I worked at Zappos, and I saw firsthand how culture really does affect a company. But through what they were doing at Zappos, I came to learn about this guy, Peter Block, and his book Community, which is absolutely phenomenal. And it really gives you this sense of like why being alive is about ownership over a society. It's about being connected to the people around you, and really how, from a selfish point of view, it's best to give and to connect, and why that really matters. So this other book, Super Cooperator, is kind of along that line, but more in the business section, and then Joy Inc. and A Connected Company kind of all fit into there. And then this is actually a culture book that we got at Zappos, so it's almost like a yearbook that you would get, but it was fun just to like all the activities that we did at Zappos and just like brings you like photos and memories of the years you were there. And I don't know, this culture stuff is no joke. It really does make a big difference. Okay, so this section is all about humor. I'm not super funny. I haven't really done stand-up comedy except this one amateur night like 10 years ago where I did a joke about Top Ramen and that little piece of soap that's like left over from the bar. So one of the projects on my GitHub was to feed in a bunch of Victorian jokes and have it spit out kind of new Victorian jokes, just kind of a little neural net that I made with TensorFlow. And I loved it. I just loved comedy. I loved the structure of comedy. I wanted to see if I could simulate that with AI, and you know, it's not very advanced, but it was fun. And this book, Messy, is all about exploring the benefits of disorder and like how, you know, we're always like in those productivity books, like simplify and organize. And this is just like be crazy and like let wild things happen and move off the cuff and like feel relaxed in what you're doing. So comedy and sort of relaxation and being kind of in flow state is a lot of what this section is about. Kind of understanding what makes us feel calm and makes us feel like ready to just try something new and experiment and have a creative thought. And then last but not least, before some more of Jen's magic books, are the fiction books. There's a few books that I've read that are fiction. It's not super common, but I do love them. And of course, we have Harry Potter down there, one of Jen's favorite. And then a book that we both read that we really loved recently is called The Midnight Library, and it kind of explores the different ways that your life can go, kind of, you know, if you would have chosen A instead of B and met someone else and then done a different job, and like how different your life can be. And like it really plays with that idea of what the best life is if you could just go through some, you know, midnight library and explore all of the different lives. There's another book called Piranesi, which is sort of like that too, which I don't have on the shelf, but I also recommend that if you like that style. Damon was there's actually two Daniel Suarez books, which are really interesting. They're like almost like dystopian AI, but not super dystopian, more just like crazy to think about like what the future will be like. So like Futurism meets kind of like dramatic and storylines, similar to maybe Ready Player One actually, where in this book you're living inside of a VR world, in this book you're living in a world where AI does things that you don't understand. And then Jurassic Park is one of my favorite books, but I actually use this to keep the only scientific paper that I've ever published. When I was at Zappos, I used some graph algorithms to analyze a structure called holacracy, which is about circles and teams that don't have a normal hierarchy. And we put a bunch of that data into Neo4j, and I was able to pull out a whole bunch of different metrics. So if you guys are ever wanting to read my paper, it's called Constructing Leading Indicator Sustainability Metrics for a Corporate Complex Adaptive System using Graph Algorithms. And it was a highly resilient network, something where you can go in and remove the nodes and the network still functions at a high level, looks a little bit different. So we were able to visually say, here's how we look, here's our goal, and here's what it means. Betweenness scores and measures of centrality, and helping the company understand the different way to think about a non-traditionally hierarchical company, and why it's good and resilient for a company that's gonna last the test of time to have some of those network structures. All right, that's about it. So these are more of Jen's magic books down here. You can see one of her magazine covers up there. And you know what? That brings us to the end. That is my entire bookshelf, which I think should give you a good sense of who I am as a person and the kind of things we will be covering. But before I let you go, I have to show you my favorite book. Let's see here. Delivering Happiness, Disciplined Dreaming. Here it is. Dylan Curious.
You're my favorite book.